Hello, welcome to AT&T Threat Track for June 7th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Manny Ortiz. Welcome, Manny.
Good to be here.
Good to see you here. And Stan Nurlov. Welcome, Stan.
Thanks, Brian.
Are you with us, Stan?
I think so.
Okay, good. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we're all here. And first we're going to go to Manny here. And wow, I mean, if it can be poached, you know, I tend to think of going out on a safari, you know, and perhaps,
Right.
you know, encountering poachers. But
Right.
I guess
Think of
they're...
poached eggs for some reason.
Poached eggs.
Right.
Yeah, you can go with any one of those, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, we're talking about bug poaching,
Right.
and bug as in, you know, security bugs, not like roaches and stuff. So
Right.
this story basically goes through, and it was an interesting, you know, a tie-in to like a home burglary scenario, where they say that a burglar comes into your house, obviously, you know, while you're not home, gets into your house, then goes through and starts taking pictures of all your valuable stuff, exits your house without taking anything, and then takes those pictures and sends them to you and says, hey, look, I've got pictures of all your stuff I got inside your house. Pay me a whole bunch of money and I'll tell you how to fix the locks on your house. IBM had identified basically this campaign that was going on that's targeting over 30 organizations right now, which basically the poaching right now is they're saying that they're asking for up to about $30,000 for these, you know, for these findings that they have. So what's involved? So what they do is they basically go in, whatever we want to call them, right? Because I'm sure they call themselves something
We'll call them
different,
hackers
but
for all
hackers
kinds,
for,
right.
right, whatever kind of hat they're actually wearing and what color it is, we don't know. But they basically go into companies, and the first and foremost, it's companies that do not have an established bug bounty program today. That's important key, right? So they don't have a bug bounty program themselves, and they go in, just like typical, they target the externally facing assets.
Sort of an unsolicited penetration test, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
that's exactly it. So they do this penetration testing, they find the vulnerabilities, they get inside the organization, and, you know, as in the scenario, they take the snapshots. Their snapshots are actually, they're looking for PII, they collect as much of it as they possibly can. Once they have that and they've extracted it, they go and dump it off into some sort of cloud store. The next step is basically send an email over to the organization and say, hey, by the way, Mr. You know, organization owner, as you can see, you know, if you go to this cloud store, I show you that, you know, in fact, I was in your organization. I did get this information from you, and if you want to know how I did it, just pay me this small fee, and I'll let you know exactly how I did this.
I don't know how you slice. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. This sounds like extortion to me.
It certainly, you know, is pushing the borders. Now,
Yeah.
the reason why they're saying that it's sort of like right on that border is because they're not, in no way are they saying that they're going to leak the information, right? They're not saying that that they're going to give it out to anybody else. They're not going to sell it to anybody else. They're saying they're just giving you the opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. It's just to play for the counter argument.
Right.
You know, capturing maybe a little segment, a handful of records or something like that to demonstrate that it was done is very different from gathering as much information as possible and exfiltrating that. But
Exactly.
I mean, perhaps part of the demonstration is the fact that large amounts of data could be exfiltrated. I mean, because that is one portion of an attack that could be detected. So I guess I'm arguing with myself here. It's not the first time I've ever done that, but I mean, it still is going to be an unpleasant experience for the client. I suspect it's going to be hard to get repeat business with an organization.
Yeah, and as they state here, the problem also is that they've proven that they've got all this information from you. There's nothing that says that after you pay the money, that they aren't going to go ahead and either leak the data or sell it off to somebody else.
On purpose or by accident.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the other problems there is they're actually taking this personal information or this very sensitive information supposed to be protected a certain way. moving it across boundaries.
I'm sure all of their systems are certified
Sure,
compliant with all
absolutely.
the
and then
HIPAA
putting it into
and
some
the
cloud
SPI.
storage up there. And then there's no guarantee they're going to delete it or properly delete it. So it's
Right.
kind of crossing the boundary in my book.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, so what would be the alternatives? First of all, I guess I'll put in a plug. We're big proponents of a bug bounty program.
Absolutely.
AT&T has a bug bounty program. Very much encourage organizations, if whoever might discover something, to make sure that they report it. So, and I guess I would, even looking at it from the other direction, look for businesses that do have a bug bounty program associated with their products. Any organization, either through their support line, if they don't have a formal bug bounty program, but to try to encourage people to, report any issues or incidents associated with their organization, so that they
Right.
can go off and do something about it. So that, by all means, is the right thing to do. But
Yeah.
to be picking out, organizations that don't have a bug bounty program, I mean, that's really kind of setting it up
Right.
in some respects.
And of course, I think we've talked about it probably many times over the years. One of the key things, also a learning experience from this, is go off and do the penetration and vulnerability testing yourself before somebody else does it for you.
A good point. Yes, absolutely. Go and do
Yeah.
the testing.
Yeah.
Make sure you're in a good position security-wise. Absolutely. All right. Very good. So Stan,
Yes, I'm still here.
you're still here. All right. Let's go. Let's go to you, Stan. And you're continuously doing malware analysis, and so I think you kind of gravitated to this story, and it gives us a little bit of a reminder of some things that we had learned about in the past. So
Yeah.
take it.
FireEye had discovered some malware that they found was similar in nature. So when they started investigating it, they noticed it's targeting control systems, industrial control systems, SCADA and stuff like that. And they dubbed it Iron Gate. So that's the big thing. But as they did their analysis, they noticed that it didn't seem, and as they worked with like the vendor that this seemed to be targeting, they found out it probably doesn't target anything production. It's only targeting, it seemed to be like some sort of a proof of concept or kind of some kind of a testing. And there's several like kind of hints and clues that they found to corroborate that. And I'm guessing they dealt with multiple samples. It was interesting also how they got the samples actually through VirusTotal. So all these samples uploaded to VirusTotal that they were able to analyze and look for similarities and differences in. And so as they did that analysis, one thing I noticed that was interesting is that they were using like a Python dropper, which I know we've seen a lot before, but it was also layers of, I guess, different kinds of installers and packers and things like that. And at the end, it also, the different variants of it did different things to protect themselves from like a sandbox analysis or automated analysis like in a virtual machine. They actually took certain steps to see, hey, am I running within like a virtual machine environment? Am I running within like a Cuckoo Sandbox environment? In fact, the way they did the Cuckoo Sandbox environment was interesting to me because, like I'm a practitioner, you could tell. They were looking for like directory names and specific names of directories like across the box, but only within certain character limits. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, the way they were searching for it. Usually when they do an anti-VM trick, they're looking for something specific, a specific string in the registry. But here they were doing something a little bit more random, just in case the environment had been set up differently. So I thought that was interesting. And the other thing I thought that was interesting about the specific malware that they observed is that, so the way it works in industrial control systems, there's like sensors out there. And then there's a controller, and then there's the operator GUI. So what the operator sees is what the sensors are reporting, and then there's some control mechanism that has to take place and act based on the information. So what they were able to do is they have this malware working in such a way that it's like taking information from like the sensor, and then what it did is like records 5 seconds of it, and then sends that 5-second loop to the operator. So that's what they see is everything is normal. And then they had the capability that they were proving out that they can actually modify things and send to the controller different commands instead of what the GUI would send. So there were some interesting things about how like the malware worked and the DLL injection techniques they had. It was basically like almost like a man in the middle, but at the DLL level is how they were able to achieve that with the malware. But I just thought to me, it was interesting. Some news outlets are out there, or some internet articles are kind of drawing parallels to Stuxnet, and maybe it might be a clone or stuff like that. The way I read the paper, it didn't seem anything like a clone to me.
Right.
It just seemed that the fact that it was attacking SCADA or targeting SCADA seemed to be the only relationships to Stuxnet. I also don't think it was as complicated as Stuxnet. Like that malware and the payloads it had seemed to be much more complicated. Even I had trouble following it at the time when it was being disclosed. Whereas with this, I was like, oh yeah, we can do this. It was really much simpler in my opinion.
But I mean, it sounds pretty sophisticated. It had a lot of the defense features, some similar capabilities or similar intent behind it. I could see this perhaps being used, and this is completely hypothetical, perhaps this being used as, somebody saying, well, how the heck could, a Stuxnet thing be done? And then being able to show, like, well, here, a number of things that the way it could be done, even though the implementation is independent.
Yeah.
Yeah. That replay feature of this one reminds me of like any good Mission Impossible movie where they played it, right?
Yeah, I was imagining the proverbial, cat going across the video in that 5-second clip, and you keep seeing the cat going past, and there's something wrong there. You see the needle.
Only if you know.
back.
And I guess it depends on the analyst, right, who's sitting behind the keyboard.
Right, exactly.
One interesting thing they did mention is when these things were uploaded to VirusTotal, they weren't actually being detected by anybody, and that's because, well, I assume that's because it seemed to have this kind of targeting, right? It's targeting a specific platform or specific DLL, and maybe the sandboxes can't really catch it. Plus, I'm assuming, also the anti-VM, anti-sandbox features.
Well, and on top of that, if I don't think it's necessarily automatic that things get put into antivirus. In fact, I know that anytime we run into a sample that isn't detected, we submit it to our antivirus vendor, and depending on the circumstances, might insist they get it in there very quickly. Yes. And I suspect that if this were a scenario where somebody found it in their environment, they would have, at least hopefully, done the exact same thing. And so I think that's partly how it proliferates through the antivirus vendors. So, perhaps that's a good piece of advice. That is, if you find samples that aren't detected, maybe you can, nudge your antivirus vendor to try to get it in there.
Yep.
So, very good. So let's talk about VirusTotal a little bit here. We were chatting about this earlier.
Yes.
My personal point of view, I think of all of the threat sharing attempts that are taking place around, there's some good private organizations. We subscribe to some where we're getting threat indicators and things. But in terms of a voluntary threat sharing environment, I think VirusTotal has done the best job so far.
Yeah.
And, we were talking about it earlier. I think the model that you really want to get is this one where as you're sharing, it feels less like sharing. It feels more like the benefit you're getting back, the analysis of that sharing process. So it's, the sharing's almost peripheral. In fact, we were saying earlier, some people might not even realize they're sharing these malware samples. They're really just trying to see, what antivirus detects it, what types of characteristics are associated with that malware.
But by having all of those samples now, I think a lot more of this kind of research is possible, which is great. And like you said, actually one of the things that I thought was great about VirusTotal as an idea when it first started, it was very simple. A lot of these websites that are really useful have this very simple idea, and it's, hey, submit your sample, we'll give you value, like you say. And it's simple. We'll just compare it, not compare it, but run it against the different AVs and tell you what the results are. Such a simple idea. Yeah. It's really useful to the end user. But then you can also build like this whole sharing threat information study capability, basically.
Yeah. If I understand correctly, this had been kind of sitting dormant in there for a couple of years, and I'm not sure how they ran across it, but
yeah, I think they were doing some analysis with like Python installers. I noticed that a lot of threat actors in the recent past have been using a lot more installers, especially Python installers. I suspect in doing that research, when you're first analyzing the malware, that first outer shell is the thing you see before you dig deeper. And they probably, as doing that analysis, they probably found these samples when they opened it up, and they're like, oh, this is slightly different than these other ones. And usually that's how it goes. I think this one's just interesting because it really targets those ICS systems, the industrial control systems.
Well, I guess perhaps in summary, for folks that are skeptical about malware being tailored to specific systems, there's obviously activity that's going on out there.
Yes.
And so, be careful that sort of past notion that this is a proprietary system and people weren't going to be able to develop malware to run in it or defeat it. That's no longer a very good argument, in my opinion. If you have something of value and somebody's motivated,
Somebody's definitely working on it.
it can be done. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So. All right. So, Manny, let's go back to you here. And speaking of installers,
I was wondering where the tie-in's going to go. Yeah, so this is what they call out-of-the-box exploitation, right? So the OEMs out there call this the OOBE, which is their out-of-box experience,
Right.
which is talking about like when you bring home that brand new spanking laptop that you're so excited about, playing the latest version of Call of Duty or Battlefield, and you.
I'm sorry,
Oh.
we don't recommend spanking your laptop. But
That's right. So you go to power it on the first time. You hit that power button, and you expect to get into the.
Right.
And what ends up happening is that the OEM, the vendor, has provided you. They think it's a service
A
to
number
you
of
to
useful
provide
tools, yes.
useful tools for you to have on your system. So. Offering you tons of, from here's our greatest updater that will make sure that you have all your drivers updated, to here's 30 days of free antivirus, and we've all seen it, right? So
you forgot the Game Center
and Game Center, right? Exactly.
and the Media Center.
Exactly.
And the,
Yeah, and on and on. This company Duo Labs decided to test out what they could do with these out-of-box updaters that are basically
Were
installed.
they predominantly focused on the security perspective of the software?
Yes, they were definitely focused on that area of it. So they took 5 vendors and 10 products. So obviously brand new, out of the box. Let's see what they provide, and then let's see if there's any kind of vulnerabilities that exists with these included installers, these updaters. And of course, as if we're talking about it here, we know that there was some pretty big surprises that came of it. And the biggest surprise, which is that out of all 10 machines that they tested, every single one of them had a vulnerability that I believe ultimately ended up giving them system access.
So it threw perhaps a man-in-the-middle attack through the update process
yes,
or something along
exactly.
those ways.
So this article, as a matter of fact, there's a 36-page paper that they wrote, which is an interesting read. And if you have the time, read through it, because it goes into very minute detail about what they tested and what they found. But one of the biggest things was that they said is that most of the vulnerabilities that they found were of the man-in-the-middle, genre. So anyway, so at the end of this, after they tested all this stuff, and again, they found that every single one of them had a hole in it. They found 12 vulnerabilities. So out of the 10, they had 12 vulnerabilities that they identified and reported, right? So they went out and reported this out. Basically, they went through and they had some concerning trends as they went through this. So there was a couple of things that they had concerns with as they went through all this at the end. What they said was that every vendor had at least one vulnerability in their updater that led to the remote code execution as system, which we know that's pretty much as bad as it gets, right? And then the vendors, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, often fail to make basic use of TLS. So they were talking about these manifest files, which is basically the machine understanding what update packages do you have available for me to download. All that information, for the most part, was being relayed via HTTP, which is a huge no-no. And then they had multiple updaters for different purposes. So they were using, instead of using like a single updater, they were using separate updaters for different purposes on the machine, which provided more chances to have something.
More opportunities to have vulnerabilities, more
Right.
software, more vulnerabilities, right?
Yep. So again, it goes into quite a bit of detail, but it was quite eye-opening to see that, we're talking about some of the biggest vendors out there in, in like home assets, laptops and desktops. And then I think some of the things that they had gone through and tested, we listed out here. So manifest transmitted over a TLS, which we just talked about, signed manifest, so actually signing those, updated transmitted over TLS, and then authentication validation. So
Right.
those were the key items that they actually tested each one of these against, and and found quite a bit of failure
All right. Well,
across the board.
take a look at it. Now, I guess that really provides a kind of a reasonable argument. Sometimes there's the question about why can't I use my, PC whatever in the enterprise environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it does kind of argue for a situation where, an enterprise install image that's been basically scrutinized for things like this and is managed as a single package,
Yep.
perhaps provides some security advantage in that way. I mean, understandably, perhaps not all that intuitive, but the fact of the matter is, anytime you install additional software on something, you're increasing the surface area for
Exactly.
potential vulnerabilities and ultimately the potential for exploits against that.
Yep.
I think it's interesting in that sense from an enterprise point of view. If you're looking for justification for having enterprise images and managing those, it may be well worth it,
yeah.
since it doesn't appear that the commercial tools have really been doing a good job. Now, that withstanding, building an enterprise image that has the same problems isn't going to really help you all that much.
Right. Exactly.
All right, very good. So let's take a little bit of a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and I'll start off with basically a story that was published by Akamai. Akamai does a regular report. I think it's quarterly on the state of the internet. I think they refer to it as. And one of the things that they featured recently is basically the use of TFTP in denial of service attacks. I think they referenced in the order of about 1.4 gigabit per second attacks is having occurred, them being used in combination with other attacks up in the, much larger. And I think that sort of diversity is fairly typical now. A lot of these denial of service attacks aren't a single attack vector. They're using a lot of tools to be able to do that. But, I think our data basically corroborates with their statement here. We had at least one attack that we'd seen that was up around 1.4 gigabits per second, although that was quite some time ago, back in March, and it seems to have been diminishing since then. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think perhaps it's not getting a good amplification effect out of it. And then similarly, looking at the scan probes, that is in terms of sources as well as probes, being the number of sources at the top here, we're only seeing tens of sources that are actually scanning, around, or at least overtly, or obviously scanning around for port 69 UDP, that being the port that a trivial file transfer protocol uses. And then in terms of the number of flows, it's relatively aggressive in some cases, kind of spiky in nature, but it has been somewhat on an increasing trend on both accounts. So that's probably the most important observation here, is that there are more activities looking for that. Even though the use and denial of service attacks perhaps is going down a little bit. And then another sort of quick check that I had done using Shodan here is showing what are, apparently TFTP servers on the internet. I'm not sure if I did a search that was, would be comprehensive, but there certainly were hits along these lines. And it's showing here on the order of about 50,000 in France, 22,000 in India, about 17,000 in China, and 15,000 in the United States. So it is on the order of perhaps hundreds of thousands across the around the globe that could be potentially recruited and used in denial of service attacks. So not something, forgive the pun, not a trivial amount. And so taking a You didn't even chuckle at that. You
No,
just
it
got
was
a
little
smirk.
bit. It was
Just a little smirk.
no,
Okay.
yeah, there was a little.
Okay. Taking a look at the, over the last year or so here of the collection of reflective denial of service attack activity, and I really just picked out the ports that are most often used in denial of service attacks. There are certainly others that can be used, and so I think actually I think DHS had published a paper some time ago that theorized a number of ports. I think as a practical matter, any service that is exposed to the internet that uses UDP has the potential of performing some type of reflective denial of service attack. That is, it's willing to respond to a spoofed source address and then sending its response off to wherever that spoofed source address is. That's a fundamental criteria around a reflective denial of service attack. And so in any case, I'll start at the bottom of the list here. You'll see, well, you probably can't see it on the graph, but there is a real little skinny sliver of blue activity down there that is looking at the trivial file transfer protocol activity on the internet that's relative to a lot of the other denial of service attack activity. So even though there have been some relatively notable attacks using that port, and this happens to be averaged over 48 hours in a moving average, so it evens the graph out a little bit here. It is not a significant contributor, relatively speaking. Next on the list here, port 19 UDP, that's character generator, which, if you send it a request and it basically sends you the alphabet back, and that has for a long time been used in reflective denial of service attacks. It really doesn't have a whole lot of real practical use on the internet, and has not changed significantly over the last year here. So it doesn't look like that has, it looks like that's still, we'll say, moderately frequently used. Next here is port 53 UDP, that's DNS, and that is frequently, in fact, I think that's the most often used reflective denial of service attack vector today. It's particularly challenging because DNS servers kind of need to be on the internet to be able to do domain resolution, and it's relatively difficult to control that. There are rate limiting capabilities on most DNS software today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's been well established across the entire infrastructure. And there are a lot of devices, and sometimes home routers, that expose DNS service to the internet, even though it really shouldn't be the case. So looking over the last year here, there's probably, I'm just eyeballing it here, between a 3- and 4-fold increase in the amount of DNS response traffic that is predominantly almost entirely the increase associated with reflective denial of service attacks. Looking at port 123 UDP, that's network time protocol, it's been a relatively modest decrease in activity over the last year or so here, but it still gets used in reflective denial of service attacks. It does have, if the monlist command is working, which I think for the most part has been pretty much patched, if the systems have been patched, but the monlist command did have a significant amplification factor, and so that was a very popular vector for a period of time. And then next, looking at Simple Service Discovery Protocol, SSDP, port 1900 UDP. That's not one that you would expect to see on the internet. It's one for actually on LAN, the LAN protocol. That has gone down very significantly over the last year, which is a very positive thing to see, that the significant amount of reduction. It's probably on the order of maybe 1/100th of what it used to be, so a good sign there. And then last but not least here is port 0 UDP. Fragmented packets show up in flow data as port 0. For the most part, the activity there is associated with basically fragmented DNS responses, and I believe character generator also generates fragmented packets as well in some cases. So between those things, you get a little bit of assessment. Now, I think overall, there probably is not any significant change left to right over the last year in terms of the denial of service attack activity, perhaps a little bit of an increase, but we've also increased the amount of data we're feeding into our system. So I'm going to say it's remained relatively flat. And a lot of this is based on services, stressor services, booter services, where they're willing to accept a fee to conduct denial of service attacks. And so that is. So we continue the activities to try to get that under control, and it's also important that organizations protect themselves from denial of service attacks if that's the case. Looking at the scanning activity over the last week or so, particularly on port 23, we've reported over the last few weeks here about a significant increase in the number of sources as well as the number of probes on port 23. This is no doubt attributable to these devices that have port 23 exposed, IoT devices or Internet of Insecure Things, devices that are not properly locked down. Still continues at unprecedented levels. This is the highest that we've seen, where if you look at the number of sources on the order of about 240, 260, 1,000 sources any given hour. So well and above anything we've seen before, as well as anything on any of the other ports. And then on a similar note, this is a port 53413 UDP. This is associated with Netis routers. Again, a home router that has a back door apparently intentionally installed on it. You can just throw a packet at it, and it's got the contents of the packet can include scripting information, and it'll execute on those scripts if it has that back door in it. And the number of sources that are performing this scanning activity has gone up. I don't think this is as high as we've ever seen it, but it's approaching that level, so on the order of 35,000 sources. This is a device that's much more popular in Asia than it is in the United States, but nevertheless, it is available in the United States, and there are devices out there. So with that, that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com, and you can find AT&T Threat Track on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube, and it's also available as an audio podcast on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ATT Business. And I'd like to thank you, Manny, for joining us today.
Yep.
Thank you, Stan, for joining us.
Thank you for having
And
me.
heart, mind, and body. And I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.